Now coming to the neuroanatomy, at least I can discuss one topic, and that is the superolateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And the question comes as describe the superolateral surface under following headings, or a short note comes as write the important sulci and gyri of the superolateral surface of the left cerebral hemisphere, or give important sulci and gyri and give important functional areas of the left cerebral hemisphere, or sometimes comes as describe the lobes and the poles, or describe the gross anatomy of the cerebral hemisphere. The first one, this cerebral or cerebrum consists of two hemispheres known as cerebral hemispheres, right and left. These two together give an appearance of ovoid structure, whereas when a single cerebral hemisphere is taken, it is a triangular in outline in a cut section having three borders and three surfaces. The three surfaces are known as the superolateral surface, medial surface, and inferior surface. Simply, you can remember in this way, the medial surface is the one which comes in relation to the similar surface of the opposite cerebral hemisphere. That is the one. The superolateral surface is the convex surface which is in contact or which comes in relation mostly with the temporal bone, the parietal bone, and part of the occipital bone. Whereas inferior surface is the one which rests on the cranial fossa, anterior and middle, and also it does not rest on the posterior, it rests on the tentorium cerebelli. These three surfaces are separated from each other by three borders, which we describe them as superomedial border, superolateral, inferolateral border, and inferomedial border. This is first an introductory thing I am giving you. Now, this is the one which is the superolateral surface which is focused. Now, each cerebral hemisphere presents three projections. These are known as the poles, one frontal, two temporal, and three occipital. And it has got four lobes. To understand four lobes, we'll have to understand some other structures before we go for the four lobes. As well, we know the human brain is showing a number of convolutions, so that it shows a number of depressions which are known as the sulci. And in between the two adjacent sulcus, whatever the cortex we have got is known as the gyrus. Now, there are a few important sulci which help you to demarcate the four lobes. One sulcus is known as sulcus. This lateral sulcus depression, it starts on the inferior surface of the brain, and it winds around in between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, reaches the superolateral surface. This is the point which is known as Sylvian point, where it divides into three branches. The two branches are not shown here. Only one branch is shown, and that branch is known as the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, which runs backwards, and the posterior end of which is upturned one. The second sulcus is known as the Pareto-occipital sulcus. This Pareto-occipital sulcus, the major portion of the Pareto-occipital sulcus is on the medial surface, but it winds around the superomedial border. This is the superomedial border we have got, and it ends on the superolateral surface. This Pareto-occipital sulcus main stem lies on the medial surface. That is the second sulcus we have got. The third point, which is known as the pre-occipital notch or a pre-occipital incisure, this border is the inferolateral border, this one, and about 5 centimeters in front of the occipital pole, this inferolateral border presents a depression which is known as a pre-occipital notch or pre-occipital incisure. With these points, we can divide the cerebral hemisphere into four lobes. The first and foremost easiest one is join the Pareto occipital sulcus, the end of the Pareto occipital sulcus with the pre-occipital notch by an imaginary line which demarcates the occipital lobe from the remaining part of the cerebral hemisphere. That is the first lobe we find. The next lobe we are going to see are the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. One more important sulcus we have got, what is known as the central sulcus. This central sulcus, in fact, it begins on the medial surface and reaches the superomedial border about half a centimeter behind the midpoint, that is midway between the frontal pole and the occipital pole. And this central sulcus runs downwards and forwards, making an angle of 70 degrees to reach the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. This is going to help you for the separation of the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Now, one more imaginary line is drawn from the horizontal part of the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, which joins the first imaginary line. That is the first imaginary line drawn from the Pareto occipital sulcus to the pre-occipital notch. Now, the part which is present below the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, in front of the first imaginary line, is known as the temporal lobe, whereas the part which is present in front of the central sulcus above the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus is known as the frontal lobe, and behind is known as the parietal lobe. Generally, these four lobes are described. There is one more lobe which is known as insular lobe or insular cortex, which is considered as a fifth lobe, and that one is not seen. This is buried deep beneath this posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. Unless this sulcus is pulled wide apart, the sulcus is the insular lobe or insular cortex is not seen. But these four lobes are generally described as having. Now, this is the one which is showing the important sulci and gyri. We are going to begin with the frontal lobe first. The frontal lobe, I said, it is present in front of the central sulcus, about a centimeter or half an inch in front of the central sulcus. You find one more sulcus which is running down towards the lateral sulcus posterior ramus, which is parallel to the central sulcus, and the name given is precentral sulcus. Between the central sulcus and the precentral sulcus, the cortex which is present is known as the precentral gyrus, which is a principal motor area, in fact. And in front of the precentral sulcus, the frontal lobe presents two sulci which are running in an anteroposterior fashion. The two gyri are known as the superior frontal sulcus and inferior frontal sulcus. These two sulci divide this frontal lobe into three gyri, which are known as superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. This inferior frontal gyrus, earlier while telling, I said the lateral sulcus begins on the inferior surface and winds around. I said the point where it winds around, I said it divides into three branches. I said this is the one branch, this is the second branch, and this posterior ramus is the third branch. Now, the one which is running horizontally forwards is known as anterior horizontal ramus. The one which is going up is known as the anterior ascending ramus, and this is the posterior ramus. Because of these three rami, the lower part of the inferior frontal gyrus is divided into three parts, A, B, C. The part of the inferior frontal gyrus which is present below is known as the pars opercularis. Then between the A and C, the part B, which is known as pars triangularis. This A is known as pars orbitalis, whereas in between these two rami is known as pars triangularis, and the part C is known as pars opercularis. Opercularis means it is forming a lid which is covering the insular cortex. Now, these three sulci which are seen in the frontal lobe. Similarly, when you come to the parietal lobe, just like the precentral sulcus, about half a centimeter behind the behind the central sulcus, we find one more sulcus which is running parallel to the central sulcus, and it is known as the post-central sulcus. The part of the cortex which is present in between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus is known as post-central gyrus, and that is the principal sensory area we have got. And behind this, behind the post-central sulcus, remaining part of the parietal lobe is traversed by a transverse sulcus, which is known as intraparietal sulcus. This intraparietal sulcus is dividing or separating the superior parietal lobule from the inferior parietal lobule. Those are the two divisions of the remaining part of the parietal lobe. Now, coming to the temporal lobe, this temporal lobe again is traversed by two sulci. One is known as superior temporal sulcus. The other one is known as inferior temporal sulcus. Accordingly, what we find is these two sulci demarcate the temporal lobe into three gyri. One is the superior temporal gyrus, the other one is the middle temporal gyrus, and the third one is inferior temporal gyrus. Now, these three sulci, one posterior ramus, second the superior temporal sulcus, third is inferior temporal sulcus. If you see the posterior ends, they are not straight and they are sharply curving upwards, and they are ending into inferior parietal lobe of the parietal lobe. And these three ends are surrounded by cortex or gyri, three gyri which surround these upturned ends of the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, the superior temporal sulcus, and inferior temporal sulcus. The one which is surrounding the posterior ramus is known as the supramarginal gyrus. The one which surrounds the superior temporal sulcus is known as marginal gyrus, whereas the third one which surrounds the posterior upturned end of the inferior temporal gyrus is known as arcus temporo-occipitalis. The last one, coming to the occipital lobe, this occipital lobe is traversed at the occipital pole by a sulcus which is known as the calcarine sulcus. And this calcarine sulcus again ends at the occipital pole, and just in front of this ending of the calcarine sulcus, you find a curved sulcus which is known as the lunate sulcus. And in front of the lunate sulcus, it is traversed by an horizontal sulcus which is known as lateral occipital sulcus. This lateral occipital sulcus divides this into superior occipital gyrus and inferior occipital gyrus. The one which again is traversed by the occipital lobe is traversed by one more sulcus which is known as transverse occipital sulcus. That is as far as the important sulci and gyri are concerned. This much a student is supposed to write when a question on the lobes, the poles, and the sulci and gyri asked. Thank you. Is it over, madam?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Thank you.